My first lecture was a kind of overture to this series. I told you that we'd be having a close look at many of Yale's greatest works of art. We'd be examining them from many points of view. I said we'd pay particularly attention to subject matter and how the subjects are depicted. I made the point that for most of its history, painting was a means, not an end. It was a means to depict the deity, heroes, saints, historical figures, and to retell episodes from longer narratives. And to do that, painters developed more and more effective techniques to convey legends and parables and stories using single images. And often these images have such beauty and such force that for a lot of people, these qualities are more than enough to justify their existence. I'm here to remind you that those aesthetic qualities had a purpose, and it was to put across stories that would instruct and please the audience. So subjects are really worth our attention. In every case, we'll also look at the artist, his patrons, the ideas and ideals of his time, how the picture was made, and other factors that deepen our understanding of the work. And today, we begin with this picture, which is about 10 times smaller in the gallery than it is on the screen. Let's just look at it for about a minute or two. I'm not going to say anything. I think we'll all just look, and then I'll guide you through it. On one side, there's a woman, nude except for some filmy drapery, held by a centaur who's using his arm to grip her and his back to support her. He's leaping forward, and she's gesturing in distress. The river separates them from the man on the far bank. He's an archer who's leaning forward and drawing a heavy bow, cocking his head, mouth open, as he aims in their direction. The river seems to be shallow and flowing fast, in between rocky formations at either side. It's being fed by water that gushes down the rocky cliff on the right. We can see the river snaking down a broad valley in the distance, bordered by trees, flowing calmly past fields that are defined by hedgerows. A few fields actually have sheep in them, if you look closely. Just beyond the girl's hand, again, if we look closely, we can make out a walled city with towers, and in the center, a very large in relation to everything around it, a familiar red dome. It may strike you that the picture has a sort of puzzling look. It's sort of harsh in places, unclear in others. This is not the painter's fault. The picture has had a hard life. It was originally painted on a wood panel that deteriorated for hundreds of years. And in 1867, the wood was removed from the painting by planing and sanding it off, leaving the paint and the ground layers, which were then glued to canvas. This is a radical operation, and it took its toll. And so did cleanings with solvents that removed discolored varnish over the centuries, but took away the freshness of the surface. Now that's pretty obvious if you compare it to other pictures by the same artists, which are much better preserved. We'll be doing that in a minute. The brown trees and the patchy fields were once various shades of green, but they've turned brown when the copper in the green pigments oxidized. The figures have suffered losses from the flaking of paint, and even worse, from the unintended stripping of the translucent oil glazes that the artist used to model the flesh in light and shade. Old restorations were mostly clumsy and had darkened. A dozen years ago, Mark Aronson, now the chief curator at the British Art Centre, undertook a study of the picture and a new treatment aimed at restoring the impression of deep space that the artist meant to give. In the early stage, the restorations were removed, and the picture looked like this. When I show you this, I feel I should have given you the warning you see on TV news. So, some of these images may be disturbing. The white patches, the gesso, are fills in just a harmless material, bringing the areas of loss up to plane. They are pretty extensive. Mark Aronson patiently filled these losses, reintegrated the surface as much as it was possible to do without doing a lot of inventing, and that's what we see today. We see most of the artist's design, some of its surface, and some very subtle inpainting. We can't make really reliable judgments about certain parts of the picture, as you can tell, including facial expressions and hand gestures, but there is enough there to admire and, in fact, to say quite a lot about. I'm going to talk in a moment about the artist and the circumstances in Renaissance Florence, the city that you saw in the background. But first, I want to say something about the story that the artist depicted here. This is an episode from the mythical life of Hercules, the demigod and strongman hero, son of Jupiter and Alcmena, as told by the Roman poet Ovid in Book 9 of the Metamorphoses. At the time the picture was painted, everybody who saw it knew this story, the story of Hercules, meaning mostly his famous labors. One of the labors was to kill, for example, the terrible nine-headed Hydra, the swamp monster of Lerna, which he did, and took away some of the Hydra's poisonous blood. We'll meet the Hydra in a minute. Sometime later, Hercules was bringing his new bride, the beautiful Deianira, and he came to the river Euenus, which was higher and faster than normal because of winter rains, and he hesitated to cross out of fear for her. Along came a centaur named Nessus, one of a race of randy, half-human creatures with poor impulse control. He offered to carry her over while Hercules crossed by himself. Once Hercules reached the bank, he heard his wife crying out. After warning Nessus, Hercules shot him with a poisoned arrow and killed him. What you're seeing is what Ovid describes, the moment when Hercules is about to rescue his bride. We see the hero putting his strength and skill to work, to prevent the desecration of their marriage. I think there's more to the picture than that, but to discover what, we're going to need more. We'll return to the story. I want to say something more about Pollaiuolo, Antonio delPollaiuolo, the painter, and how the picture fits into his work, into his times, and into the history of narrative painting. He was the son of Jacopo Benci, a poultry seller in Florence, a Pollaiuolo, which gave him and his younger brother Piero their nicknames. Here you see them on their gravestone. He and his brother, after a period of training and apprenticeship, became partners in their business, which was to supply pretty much anything artistic that private clients wanted. Clients being church officials, guilds, leading families, or the ruling Medici and their court. That included, first and foremost, goldsmiths' work and silversmiths' work and sculpture, three-dimensional things, but also paintings and engravings, designs for tapestries, parade trappings for horses, helmets, tournament banners, shields, liturgical vestments, other decorated objects, practically anything you can think of. This kind of virtuosity wasn't unusual in the 15th century. The contemporaries in Florence, for example, Paolo Uccello, Domenico Ghirlandaio, Verrocchio, all of them were trained as goldsmiths. In the early 1460s, a connoisseur in Florence called Antonio delPollaiuolo, you try it, called Antonio delPollaiuolo the leading master of the city, perhaps of all time. This is the view commonly held by all who know such things. Antonio and Piero were born 10 years apart in 1431 and 1441. We don't know who taught Antonio, but in the late 1450s, while he was still apprenticed to the goldsmith Milano Dei, Antonio, was paid 2/3 of the price of this 6-foot-high silver cross that the Dei workshop made for the baptistry. So he'd risen to the top already. And much later on, he wrote that he and his brother had painted 3 very large paintings on canvas for the palace of the Medici. And we know from an inventory 30 years later that they hung in the Sala Grande of the great palace designed by Michelozzo, and that they were almost 12 feet high, huge paintings and hugely important. They must have been commissioned by Piero de' Medici, the de facto ruler of the city-state, and they showed scenes that proclaimed an ideal of strength and prowess that would be very good advertising for the Medici themselves. Those huge pictures have disappeared, but it's believed that these 2 little panels in the Uffizi show us what they look like. Hercules killing the Hydra on the left, and Hercules squeezing the life out of the giant Antaeus. You see what made Antonio delPollaiuolo famous, these amazing physiques. This Hercules is not only credible anatomically and not just strong, but he's also poised and graceful and skillful. This is not the Hercules of ancient Roman statues, who's usually shown at rest, displaying the heavily muscled body full of potential energy. Instead, it's a more kinetic Hercules, whose limbs are much more slender. He's evidently been studied from life, from a real model, a man who might have been moonlighting from a day job on the docks of the Arno. We have, in fact, a marvelous drawing for one of these of a model who's even skinnier than in the study than in the painting. There was also a 3rd canvas mentioned in the inventory of the Medici of Hercules killing the lion. It's also disappeared. And for that, we don't have a painted replica, but we do have something to suggest what it looked like. That's this door panel executed in intarsia, kind of mosaic in wood, that looks as though it must record the lost painting, since it matches the compositions of the other 2 and is completely in the figure style of Antonio Pollaiuolo. Hercules in the Yale picture was evidently painted some years later, but he has a very similar kind of lanky body type. This comparison gives you an idea of what the Yale Hercules once looked like before the subtle upper layers were removed from his limbs. The flesh looks almost flayed, like a peeled shrimp, compared to the suave modeling of the other 2. His pose is like the Hydra killer's pose, but Yeah, but spun around 180 degrees, so we see him from the back. Now here, Antonio was thinking like a sculptor. Making multiple views of the same or similar poses was part of the working method of sculptors, as we know well from many of Pollaiuolo's drawings. And this, of course, was the main advantage that sculpture had over painting. It gave you multiple views of a single object if you turned it around or you walked around it. The drawing was admired by somebody, anyway, who either owned it or took upon himself the right to inscribe something on it on the upper left. This is the work of Antonio di Jacopo del Pollaiuolo, most excellent and famous Florentine painter and most outstanding sculptor. Whatever he depicted, whenever he depicted the image of man, see how marvelously he's rendered the limbs. In this famous engraving, Pollaiuolo combined a whole collection of men in a single composition, the so-called Battle of Nude Men, which doesn't, of course, actually seem to recreate any battle, but instead thought to be a kind of source book of poses for other artists, and of course a demonstration of the artist's extreme virtuosity. Here at the left and the middle is Antonio's greatest and most original work in sculpture, this small bronze of Hercules and Antaeus, which is so similar to the Medici painting on the right that it may well have been made from the same preparatory drawings or even from the same wax model. We should look at the expressions of these men, which are something quite new in painting. Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer of Renaissance artists, wrote a century later that, and I quote him now, "The strength of Hercules is seen most vividly, for the muscles and the nerves are all strained. The head of Hercules shows the gnashing of teeth so well in harmony with the other parts. Antaeus, who is crushed in the arms of Hercules, is seen sinking and losing all his strength and giving up his breath through his open mouth." Now, these are not idealized figures. These are real men baring their teeth in death struggles. Then there are the landscapes in these two little pictures, landscapes of home. These are airy views of the Tuscan countryside with rivers winding through it, a lot like the Yale landscape, but much better preserved in detail and atmosphere. Well, stories about a Greek hero are placed in the familiar surroundings of Pollaiuolo's contemporary audience, which was, after all, territory ruled by the family who owned those pictures, the Medici. Putting an ancient story into a contemporary landscape to make it more vividly familiar, make it stick with a contemporary audience, is not something Pollaiuolo invented. He used the device quite often, but it originated in the Netherlands and was adopted by Italians from the mid-15th century on. You all know this painting, the so-called Mérode altarpiece by Robert Campin in the Metropolitan Museum, shown at the cloisters. At the left, you see that Annunciation to Mary is going on in a small upstairs room, while at the far right, the detail, her elderly carpenter husband Joseph is at work making mouse traps, which he sets out here on the shelf for sale outside his window. But beyond is a contemporary street scene shown in the most minute detail. It puts the Annunciation into the here and now, and not incidentally into the lives of the people way over at the left-hand side of the altarpiece, who paid for the picture, the donor and his wife. As another example, here's a fresco by Alessio Baldovinetti, an older, more conservative Florentine artist at the left, that was either done shortly before Pollaiuolo painted the Labors of Hercules for Cosimo de' Medici, in which case Pollaiuolo learned from it, or else this artist took over the younger artist's idea. We're not sure which. And on the right, the great Piero della Francesca in the 1470s, locating a nativity just outside a contemporary city. There's another small panel with a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses that must also be by Antonio Pollaiuolo. It shows the nymph, Daphne, pursued by the amorous Apollo and escaping by being turned into a laurel tree, even as Apollo holds her tenderly and lifts her up. This is a very hard episode to illustrate, as you may imagine, especially in mid-metamorphosis. And there aren't any successful attempts I know of before Pollaiuolo. I think Pollaiuolo succeeds because he's able to express Apollo's doomed adoration by his rapt expression and something of Daphne's calm surrender in her kind of strange abstracted expression. Daphne's already rooted to the earth with one leg, but Apollo is still running with his scarf flying behind. The whole action sequence, from running to rooted, you see summed up in the legs down below, the left to right sequence of perfectly drawn limbs and feet. Stranger still, I promise. Writers of the time praised Pollaiuolo's drawing, his disegno. For Florentine artists in particular, drawing was the soul of painting. It's what gave the artist the semi-divine power to recreate the world around. In addition to his marvelous figure drawings on paper, we have these very strange murals in a villa on the outskirts of Florence. They're damaged. They're hardly more than large line drawings, but they show how audacious Pollaiuolo could be in picturing energetic poses from various points of view. Nothing like this had been seen before. Like everything I've shown you, though the subject is not religious, but flagrantly pagan. It seems to actually represent a moresca, a Morris dance, the Renaissance equivalents of the wild dances that the entourage of Bacchus did, often seen in Roman relief sculpture, which Pollaiuolo knew and studied. He's absolutely sure of himself in the way he renders these people in 2 dimensions. Really quite an astonishing feat. In 1475, Antonio Pucci, a member of the Florentine oligarchy and a close ally of the Medici, commissioned a large altarpiece for the family chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian. It's now in the National Gallery in London. Vasari wrote that it was the most praised work that Antonio ever made. He mentions the horses, the nudes, the beautifully foreshortened figures, and he fastens on one of the archers who is resting his crossbow across his chest and bending down in order to load it. We see his veins and muscles, says Vasari. We see his veins and muscles swelling, and the man himself holding his breath in order to gain more strength. All the figures demonstrate the ingenio of the artist, he says, that ingenuity and skill that's partly inborn and partly developed. The picture is a strange and wonderful thing. At this moment in the 1470s, Pollaiuolo, in thinking of such a composition, could choose from 2 different models of how to paint Sebastian, who was a Roman soldier converted to Christianity under Diocletian. One you see on the left. You could show the scene of the shooting, crowded with archers and spectators, and God the Father presiding at the top, the way Benozzo Gozzoli had done. This picture follows the description in the Golden Legend, which is a handbook of saints' lives, where it's said that Sebastian was shot through like a porcupine. Or at the right, you could show him all alone, after the executioners had left, making a kind of devotional object out of him, which is what Mantegna did. Mantegna, Pollaiuolo's exact contemporary in Milan. And it's what Botticelli did in Florence at just the same time as Pollaiuolo's picture. Now here we have to admit that the devotional object might also have served as an object of erotic fantasy for some people at least. Pollaiuolo chose the Botticelli formula when he came to paint the picture. His overall composition is meant to recall the crucifixion, of course, Sebastian therefore following Christ in death, but he eliminates the heavenly apparition, and instead attention comes to these archers who are hard at work, upstaging even Sebastian, who's raised high up above him. This Sebastian is not at all the bearded Christ-like victim in Botticelli's fresco on the left, but more like Botticelli's, a handsome, smooth-faced youth with a contemporary haircut. We actually know this guy's name. His name, according to Vasari, was Juno di Lodovico Capponi, a nobleman from the Medici circle who was reputed to be the most beautiful young man in Florence. As Saint Sebastian, here, pale with flawless features, he makes the crudest kind of contrast with the types down below who are trying to kill him. The archers on this death squad have a kind of knobby, sweaty faces and scruffy hair, and they're doing their job with all the single-minded skill they can muster. The artist shows quite methodically just how they went about it. And you have 6 soldiers, 6 Sebastian, arrows sticking into Saint Sebastian. And he gives in detail their sort of rangy physiques, and he lines them up and arranges them symmetrically, front to back, in front to back pairings of the same sort of artifice that we saw in that engraving of the Battle of the Nude Men. And in the background, there are more Roman soldiers on horseback. I hope you can see them in the lower left. And the ruins of a splendid triumphal arch, symbolizing the empire in decay. And then further away, another river valley that might well be Tuscany, except that there's a large walled city in the distance with an amphitheater that's much more likely to be an imaginary view of Rome in the time of the Emperor Diocletian, where the event took place. The Pucci family paid Antonio Pollaiuolo 300 scudi for this picture, a very solid price. At this point, having mentioned Pucci and the money, I want to come, and before coming back to our painting, I'd like to just step back a couple of minutes and remind ourselves of what made patronage like this possible for the Pucci and their friends, the Medici and the Strozzis and the Capponis and the Sassetti and the Pazzi and the Tornaboy, down a long list. This was a constellation of rich, civic-minded families that built palaces in Florence, commissioned chapels with objects of silver and gold, and ordered pictures and sculpture on a scale that hadn't been seen in Europe since antiquity. The money mostly came from silk and wool cloth manufacturing, but recently more and more came from banking. Florence had long been in an economic slump since the middle of the 1300s, after the crash of the 2 big banks, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. Forgive me if all of this sounds vaguely familiar to you. The crash of 2 big banks, the Bardi and the Peruzzi, the plague, we haven't had that yet, of 1348 to 50, and the Black Death. Population had shrunk, trade had suffered. There were constant wars, especially with the Visconti in Milan, and even for a couple of years with the Pope, causing insecurity and political instability in Europe generally. But during Pollaiuolo's lifetime, peace had returned to Florence, and under Cosimo de' Medici and his successors, there was quite a lot of internal stability and a big revival of banking profits. Some of the profits went into artistic and intellectual patronage by the ruling family, which set the tone, and by their friends and their rivals for magnificence and munificence in Florence. Here on the left, in this great procession of the Magi in the Medici Palace, are Cosimo and Piero de' Medici, and the younger members of his family, painted in a chapel in their own palace, portrayed as the wise men from the East, traveling to bring tribute to the newborn Christ. The Medici and the rest of the oligarchy supported many dozens of learned men, not theologians as they would have been in the Middle Ages, but scholars of classical literature, like the men at the left. The result was the discovery and the translation of many unknown Greek and Latin texts, a whole body of new history and literature and ideas and commentary, and what's more, a much wider lay audience for all of this. Florentines saw themselves as the proper heirs of this classical tradition, since by legend their lands had been a Roman colony. Leonardo Bruni wrote in 1404, "Of all the peoples, the Florentines appreciate liberty the most and are the greatest enemies of tyrants." So there were good symbolic reasons why Brunelleschi designed the new foundling hospital with round arches and rectangular windows to emulate ancient Roman buildings. Florence was a republic, as Rome had been. Its institutions should not be housed in the Gothic architecture of the descendants of the barbarians across the Alps. So the argument went, no, Florentine buildings should advertise their Roman ancestry. And remember, this kind of symbolism for 3 centuries later is when ancient Greek democracy was better understood. The citizens of the new United States of America used Greek revival architecture to signal their own liberation and associate themselves with Greek democratic ideals. So did the Florentines. Latin and Greek texts, rediscovered by humanist scholars, made it possible to retell classical myths, such as the ones in Ovid, which had been known for centuries, with much more authority and detail. Scholars tried to understand what the stories might mean and what they could teach a modern audience. I'm sure that some of you read the book by Stephen Greenblatt recently called The Swerve, about the Florentine book hunter Poggio Bracciolini and the many ancient texts that he discovered in monastic libraries, especially the most amazingly modern of all, the great poem by Lucretius called On the Nature of Things. The book is very worthwhile. Get it and read it if you can make time. Francesco Petrarch here saw contemporary Italian civilization emerging from what he was the first to call the Dark Ages. He saw classical literature as the model of style and a fund of moral instruction. His younger friend, the humanist poet Giovanni Boccaccio, see on the right, wrote on the genealogy of the gods and the gods of the Gentiles, which is a Latin encyclopedia of Greek and Roman deities and their myths, using his knowledge of Greek and traveling far and wide to monasteries and palaces, to libraries. Book that he wrote and revised in manuscript until he died in 1374. But handwritten or copied texts were, of course, all you could produce until printing became possible later. So the spread of this literature was slower than you might have expected in our times. But public interest in this work, the work of these scholars, ran very high. I mean, here's an instance, a petition made by a group of citizens to the city of Florence that the famous Boccaccio be hired at state expense to give public readings of the greatest modern classic, the Divine Comedy of Dante, a Latin text of the utmost importance, a great turning point in the intellectual life of Europe. Read the Divine Comedy with Boccaccio's own learned commentaries. Boccaccio began the readings in the Church of the Badia, which you see here on the screen, in the fall of 1373, but then he took sick and couldn't finish. Dante, in his epic tour through heaven, hell, and purgatory, refers to characters and stories that, in turn, Boccaccio explains and elaborates on in length, including, by the way, Hercules and Deianira. Pollaiuolo himself wasn't a learned man, but there were professional scholars like Marsilio Ficino who advised artists on commissions for the Medici, and many amateur humanists in the wider circle around the great men who kept up on the recent discoveries and interpretations like those of Boccaccio and other people. Piero de' Medici didn't hang his Hercules paintings in the salone of his palace as mere decoration. He had a political purpose. Those huge images were demonstrations of the supreme prowess with which he wanted to identify his family and his city-state. The labors that Hercules performed were shown as work. They reminded people that Hercules didn't earn his fame by just the exercise of privilege or by the favor of the gods, but by laboring to overcome obstacles and defeat hostile creatures. In Florence, Hercules was adopted as the prototype of the military commander, the condottiero, another kind of new man, who, alongside the rich merchant and the learned scholar, became a defining leader in the life of the state. These men, these condottieri, succeeded by strength and boldness, courage, force of personality, not by birth. They rose from obscurity to nobility, typically, and to wealth, by leading private armies, being hired by Italian city-states in their endless wars against one another. Standing armies mostly didn't exist at this period in Italy. You hired mercenaries if you needed to fight somebody. This one is Erasmo de Nardi, nicknamed Gatta Melata, the honey cat, who switched sides for the highest bidder, which for a while was Florence. And in 1437, he became the dictator of Padua, which is where the statue by Donatello is, and commemorated not only Gatta Melata, but by echoing the ancient portrait in Rome that everybody knew of Marcus Aurelius, he reminded people that he was a latter-day Marcus Aurelius, a legitimate ruler, rather than an armed usurper. More statues and paintings by the cream of Florentine painters and sculptors were made to memorialize other successful mercenary soldiers. Pollaiuolo hoped he could join the list. He made, in fact, several drawings of this man, Francesco Sforza, one of 7 bastard sons of a condottiero, who fought and schemed his way, so did Francesco Sforza, schemed his way to becoming the Duke of Milan. Now, what Pollaiuolo was hoping for was a commission to make a bronze statue like this for a public space in Milan, a real statue, not the cheap substitutes that were painted to look like statues and that you see in the Cathedral of Florence, like these 2 huge frescoes by his contemporaries, Paolo Uccello in the middle and Andrea del Castagno on the left. Pollaiuolo jumps ahead of every other artist of his time in making the horse rear up like Nessus the centaur and making the commander who rides him look even more superhumanly confident. Of course, bronze being heavy, some tricks were going to be necessary to hold up the front end, which is what that prostrate warrior was doing, or would have done had the statue been made, but it only happened on paper. The statue never got made, and Pollaiuolo never did have to solve the support problem. So in Pollaiuolo's time, a small assortment of forceful hero figures were portrayed, admired, kept in civic memory. From recent history, there were the condottieri who rose to power. From ancient myth, our man, the irresistible demigod Hercules. And from biblical history, there was the future king of the Israelites, David. David, the youthful giant killer. The victory of David over Goliath was understood as an emblem and a prefiguration of the Florentine state, which saw itself as, like David, young, beautiful, skilled, capable of defeating all its rivals through cleverness and moral superiority, not just size and brute strength. Now, David was a favorite subject in Florence. There are just here 3 full-length portraits by leading artists. At the left, Donatello, the bronze statue of this very svelte David, which Cosimo de' Medici placed in the center of the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici. In the center is the slightly older painter who seems to have the strongest effect on Pollaiuolo. That's Andrea del Castagno, a painted parade shield, actual shield that one would have held up, with a David on it, who's already won, note Goliath there, but defying other potential attackers. And at the right, Antonio Pollaiuolo's own David, as a relaxed, calm, cocky young contemporary Florentine, energetic to his fingertips, but utterly composed. Well, after a committee of Florentines decided that Michelangelo's colossal marble statue of David, which was finished in 1504, didn't really belong on the roof of the Duomo, which is where it had been ordered for. It was set up instead in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government. That confirmed David's status as a kind of Old Testament patron saint and symbol of the vigilance of Florence against any invader. When a companion piece to the David was ordered from Michelangelo, the subject was to be Hercules. Hercules, who would stand opposite David and symbolize physical strength. The Hercules was carried out by Michelangelo's pupil, Baccio Bandinelli, and of course it's still in place. The David we see in that same location is a copy made when the original was moved to the Academy in the 19th century. But they stand just outside the seat of government, guardians of the Republic, symbols of Florentine power, moral as well as physical. So returning to the Yale painting, amazing, but I'm doing it. Returning to the Yale painting, I want us to look at how Pollaiuolo tells this story and ask what the story might have signified in its time, speculate too on what it might mean in our own time. But first let's look at the river and the landscape. They play a bigger role in the drama than they do in any other narrative picture of this period. The amorous centaur uses the rushing river to trick Hercules out of his bride. You heard that part of the story. We see the stream from just upstream as it flows past, fed by springs, some of which we see gushing down in the rocks. The river separates the actors, stretches the action across a broad span, and that emphasizes the tension of the moment. Nessus springs almost out of the picture with his frightened Deianira. Hercules takes the bow to full tension just before he lets fly. Our viewpoint is close to the action and only just a little above it. We're really in the landscape with the actors. It's not, and the landscape is not a backdrop the way it is in the Labor's paintings. And Pollaiuolo shapes the land to reinforce the shapes of the figures. The cliffs on both sides kind of lean in with the figures, pushing them together in this fatal encounter. Between them, in the center, the riverbank swoops up and echoes the curve of Nessus, the outline. The snaky river, the bending compound bow, they too make a kind of rhyme. So the scene gets some of its dramatic urgency from the interplay of characters and landscape. Look at how the figures work. Even in their damaged condition, they use tremendously expressive body language. I mean, Nessus not only springs forward, as horses do on Roman coins like this one, but he also twists around towards us, rotating towards us with his upper body and reaching across to hang on to Deianira. His head and his upper body, by the way, are the best preserved parts of the picture. She pulls away from him, but twists her head and shoulders around in a complex movement. All this shows Pollaiuolo's prowess with the human figure, and it also reflects the study of ancient prototypes for difficult poses. On the left, you can see just such a twisted figure. Neither centaur nor girl is exactly classically handsome. Nessus's face seems to express more concern than gust or than guile or lust. And as for her face, her head is mostly reconstructed. We really can't draw conclusions from her expression. Her body is, how shall we say, bottom heavy in relation to the classical Roman norm, but her full belly and her narrow shoulders are in keeping with relatively rare mid-15th century images of nude women in European painting. Here are two famous ones of a generation earlier. I said earlier that his physique is unconventional, that is, Hercules' physique, unconventional compared to every ancient Roman example, but also unconventional compared to classicizing Hercules figures who were appearing in contemporary sculpture. Here are examples by Andrea Pisano and Nanni Di Banco, examples that he had close by for studies. These are the reliefs in the Campanile by Pisano of about a century earlier on the left, and on the right by the sculptor of the Porta della Mandorla of the Florentine Cathedral of about 1420. In fact, the lunging pose of his Hercules does somewhat resemble a Roman bronze statuette that was in Florence at the time, a Marsyas, which used to be called a fearful nude, a piece that Pollaiuolo might have known in the original or in a cast. In any case, his Hercules is not a beautiful bodybuilder, but the workman, and his prowess seems at least as much mental as physical. I want to return to the story. At the beginning, I told you the part of the story in Ovid that describes the action that we see here. Nessus, having tricked Hercules, carries away Deianira. Hercules shoots Nessus with a poison arrow, and this is what we don't see, the centaur dies. So why paint this scene? At this period, in the 1470s, the labors of Hercules are a pretty common subject. But this abduction is not one of the labors, and in fact is very rarely depicted. Pollaiuolo was the first artist to give it serious independent treatment, and that's unusual, to say the least. We might be able to guess why he did it if we knew who commissioned the picture, but we don't have any record of this painting at all until the times that James Jackson Jarvis owned it and it came into Yale's possession in the 19th century. There have been a couple of answers to why it was painted. One is that it was about the sanctity of marriage and Hercules' defense of it. This connects to a tradition of decorating this type of painting, the tradition of decorating this kind of furniture, which you see in the Yale Gallery here. That is a marriage chest, or Casoni, very large chest. You see here not only a complete, very rare object, a complete Casoni, unbroken up, and then the results of many acts of vandalism by art dealers and others to remove the painting and show it as an independent picture. What they've all got in common is that they're either subjects from classical antiquity, mythology, and allegory. Here's an example, though, of a Casoni with this subject that is of interest for us. I've only got this rather poor picture from an auction house catalog where it was sold recently. It makes 2 points. One, and you see it, I think, here's the front panel and the two end panels, and then two views. 2 points. One, that the Yale picture is not the right shape to have been the front panel or one of the end panels of a Casoni. The other point is that this example has our subject at one end, Hercules and Deianira, and at the other, Hercules and the Hydra. You'll see in a minute why I'm interested in this conjunction of subjects. But I have to admit that a lot of these chests were put together in the 19th century out of assorted odd panels, and nobody is sure that this particular chest can be relied on. Anyway, the Yale painting could be about marriage, even as an independent picture, which it's seems to be an independent picture. It's the argument of Alison Wright in her excellent book on the Pollaiuolo brothers, which is excerpted in your readings. The argument is, she mentions this allegorical picture by Botticelli of a few years later, here on the left, that shows a centaur being seized by the hair by the wise Athena and restrained. She writes, "The centaur was a creature who represented irrational and dangerous passions, and Nessus conforms to the type through his illicit abduction of Deianira. Thus, in slaying Nessus, Hercules' action could be read as a moral victory of the rational. Seen allegorically, his victory restores the legitimate social order, and specifically in this case, the social order represented by marriage. In a society riddled by anxiety over female chastity and familial legitimacy, the restoration of Hercules' bride is exemplary and reassuring." Well, maybe. But mythological stories are mutable, changeable, depending on who's telling them. Ovid points to another source of trouble for Hercules, besides irrational creatures like Nessus. It's his jealous stepmother, Juno. Juno harasses Hercules relentlessly from the time of his birth, putting snakes in his cradle, which of course he strangles playfully. And when he grows up, she makes his labors even more difficult, not relenting on him until he's been tortured horribly. And only then did she agree that Jupiter could place him among the gods. You could interpret Hercules and Deianira, that story, as the playing out of the wrath of Juno, unseen, implacable, whose grievance was the chronic unfaithfulness of her husband, Jupiter. This would be the story of the sins of the father visited on the son, and Juno's role as the enforcer of justice. This is a kind of cause and effect familiar in Greek tragedy, and plausible enough, and certainly a lesson you're perfectly free to draw if you want to. But you might expect Pollaiuolo to allude to Jupiter in some way, Juno in some way in this picture, and he doesn't. I want to suggest another way to read the story, which depends on events that are not depicted here, but that would certainly be known to Pollaiuolo and to his educated audience. It takes us in a somewhat different direction from the defense of marriage and the moral victory of the rational, and away from the jealous Juno, too. To get there, we need to read the whole story in Ovid, including the before and the after of what we see here. Here's the before. Hercules killed the Hydra, then dipped his arrows in the poisonous blood, and used the arrows later in several of his labors. And here's the after. Hercules loosed the arrow and hit Nessus. And Ovid says, when the shaft was pulled out, blood mixed with the deadly arrow poison of the Hydra gushed out. Nessus trapped this and murmured to himself, of course, "I will not die without revenge." And he gave his tunic, soaked with warm blood, to Deianira, whom he abducted, presenting it to her as if it were a gift for reviving waning love. So he fools her into thinking that the blood is a love potion that she might need later on to awaken Hercules' desire for her. Later on, a rumor reached Deianira that, and I'm quoting again, Ovid, Hercules was filled with passion for Iole, the daughter of Eurytus. Terrified at first by the rumor of this new affair, she indulges in tears. Her thought traced various courses. Of all of them, she preferred the thought that of sending her the shirt imbued with Nessus' blood to restore her husband's waning love. Unwittingly, she ordered her servant to give the present to her husband. Hercules the hero took it without thought, put on the shirt of Nessus, soaked in the poison of the Lernaean Hydra. He was making offerings and incense and reciting prayers over the first flames and pouring a libation of bowl of wine onto the marble altar. The power of the venom warmed and released by the flames, dissolved, dispersing widely through the limbs of Hercules. With his usual courage, he repressed the groans while he could. When his strength to endure the venom was exhausted, he overturned the altar and filled the woods with his shouts. He tries at once to tear off the fatal clothing. Where it is pulled away, it pulls skin away with it, and revolting to tell, it either sticks to the limbs from which he tries in vain to remove it, or reveals the lacerated limbs and his massive bones. His blood hisses and boils with the virulence of the poison, like incandescent metal dipped in cold pool. There's no end to it. The consuming fires suck at the air in his chest. Dark sweat pours from his whole body. His scorched sinews crackle. His marrow liquefying with the secret corruption, he raises his hands to the heaven, crying, "Juno, feed on my ruin. Feed, cruel one. Gaze from the heights at this destruction and sate your savage heart. Death would be a gift to me, a fitting offering from a stepmother." Then Hercules asks bitterly for what purpose he performed his heroic labors. In a fury, he kills the servant that brought the poisoned garment. Then he built a funeral pyre. As the mass caught light from the eager fire, he spread his lion's pelt on the summit of the pile of logs and lay down. Now the fierce flames, spreading on every side, were crackling loudly and licking at his body. He, unconcerned and scornful of them. Ovid closes the story with the Apotheosis of Hercules. He says, "When the hero had shed his mortal body, the all-powerful father of the gods, carrying him upward in his four-horse chariot through the substanceless clouds, set him among the shining stars." Well, earlier I asked the question art historians are always asking, well, why did the artist choose this episode to paint? What did his audience see in it? I'd like to end this lecture on a note of triumph and give you a confident answer, but neither I nor anybody else has got one. But if we can't recover the intention of the artist, the reception of the audience, if we can't do that, what are we going to do? Just let this picture please us and entertain us? It could. But I think we ought to consider the outline of the whole story. One more time. Hercules, after his horrific torture, dies the death of a hero, but the story and the Pollaiuolo painting have a dimension beyond heroism. The entire last part of his life brings ironic and fatal reversals for Hercules. You've heard them. You could call it a story of acts with unintended consequences. Hercules does a good deed by ridding the world of the Hydra, but he chooses to keep its poison so his arrows would cause incurable wounds. Nessus is wounded and dies, but not before he collects some of his own poisoned blood. He tricks Deianira into giving it to the faithless Hercules. She does, and Hercules dies a hideous death, and Nessus is avenged. The particular episode that this artist paints is not just another feat of heroism by Hercules, but it's the beginning of the end for him. It's the feat that costs him his life. Seen in this light, the enduring moral would seem to me to be that acts have consequences. He kills by poison, he dies by poison. The punishment fits the crime. Hercules gets poetic justice. Now, this may have been at least part of Pollaiuolo's intention in choosing this episode from the longer narrative and presenting it to a sophisticated audience who did know the whole story. I should add that the idea of poetic justice, the idea of the punishment fitting the crime, that was no new line of thought for Italians at the time. Those ideas run all through Dante's Inferno. You remember, the hypocrites in Dante are forced to walk around, the hypocrites are forced to walk around in lead coats, gilded on the outside. The heartless traitors are frozen forever in ice. The sorcerers and alchemists have their necks twisted so that they can only walk backwards, and so on. That's my suggestion. We will leave Hercules here, poised for another victory, but little suspecting what comes next. And in the lecture series, what comes next is a picture that, takes us half a century further into the Renaissance and shows another energetic, unsuspecting male at a turning point in his life. So please come if you can and see how it all turns out. Thank you.